Pay for delay is a misnomer in at least two.
You can see this entire hearing online at cspan.org. We're going to leave it now for live coverage of the U.S. Senate. Senators have returned from their lunch meetings and will work this afternoon on spending for the next budget year for transportation, housing, and community development programs. Live Senate coverage now here on C-SPAN 2.
Not been for the passing of my predecessor, Senator Frank Lautenberg, I would not be here today. So I want to associate myself with the tributes that have already been paid to his memory. Madam President, it occurred to me that if I waited any longer before speaking on the Senate floor for the first time, my maiden speech and my farewell address would be one and the same. My service representing the people of New Jersey in this great institution will be brief. Yet for me, I know it will be one of the highlights of my life. I want to express my heartfelt appreciation to my family, my wife Jenny and my children, Al and Hannah, for enthusiastically supporting the decision we made as a family to allow me to be here. As everyone in public life knows, the support of your family is indispensable to your service. My daughter Hannah is here with me in Washington this week supporting her dad. I'm also incredibly grateful to Governor Christie for the confidence he has again shown in me by naming me to this position. I am deeply humbled by the opportunity to serve the people of my state, the state where I was born and raised and am raising my own family, here in the United States Senate. Some refer to senators who have been appointed to unexpired vacancies as caretakers. I reject that label for myself, as I imagine others have who found themselves in similar positions. No one who has the high honor and privilege of serving in this body should ever be content to serve as a caretaker, to merely keep the seat warm. Representing the people, even for a brief period of time, demands that one work to make a difference. My Senate colleagues show me that every day with their commitment. Today, I would like to use this great honor to help give voice to a shockingly large and largely unseen group of people who have no voice of their own. The United Nations estimates there are upwards of 27 million of them around the globe. There are believed to be at least 100,000 of them here in the United States. They are among the most exploited, abused, and neglected people on the face of the earth. They are victims of human trafficking. They are, to be more direct, modern-day slaves. Over the course of my career, both as an assistant U.S. attorney and, more recently, as the Attorney General of New Jersey, I have come face to face with the terrible misery of human trafficking. The faces of its victims are haunting. They are often young, and more often than not, they are female. They come from every corner of the world, but especially from those places where poverty and want define day-to-day existence. They are exploited by human predators that have no respect for the law and no respect for basic decency. Often lured by their captors with empty promises of a better life, the victims are instead utterly betrayed. These victims are robbed of their youth, their freedom, their dignity, their health, and sometimes even their lives. They must not be forgotten. They must not be robbed of justice. Human traffickers, the purveyors of the modern-day slave trade, do enormous harm to their victims. When these victims are used in the promotion of such crimes as prostitution and child pornography, they are also debasing our neighborhoods and our families. As they exploit the victims by forcing them to labor for little or no money in a wide variety of workplaces and appalling circumstances, they are also exploiting employers who offer good jobs at fair wages and safe working conditions. And as they abuse their victims in ways too horrible to contemplate, they are also abusing our commitment as a society to honor the dignity of every human being. My first exposure to fight against human trafficking goes back to my tenure as an assistant U.S. attorney in New Jersey. And as New Jersey's Attorney General, I made this fight a priority, issuing a directive on human trafficking to sharpen New Jersey's focus in the fight against this terrible crime by channeling more resources and greater attention to the problem. This effort is already producing results. Just over a week ago, the New Jersey Attorney General's office arrested 6 people in Lakewood, New Jersey, and charged them with various human trafficking and other offenses. Accused of running a sophisticated network that brought dozens of women into the United States from Mexico to work in illegal brothels. Those arrested in Lakewood will now face new, tougher penalties if convicted. And their victims have been saved from the degradation their captors were subjecting them to. As satisfying as it is to see justice done to the traffickers, there is even a greater sense of accomplishment in restoring freedom to those who are held brutally in bondage. There are, of course, efforts underway to find and prosecute human traffickers both at home and abroad, as well as efforts to identify and aid the innocent victims of human trafficking. The Department of State's Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons leads our nation's efforts to combat human trafficking around the world. The Department of Homeland Security's Blue Campaign works with law enforcement, state and local governments, various non-governmental organizations, and other private groups to provide information, training, and outreach. Countless law enforcement officers and prosecutors at every level of government are united in the fight to end human trafficking. And untold numbers of organizations and caring people have committed themselves to aiding the survivors of this terrible assault on human dignity. In this body, the Senate Caucus to End Human Trafficking, led by my distinguished colleagues, the senior senator from Connecticut, Mr. Blumenthal, and the junior senator from Ohio, Mr. Portman, helps to combat human trafficking by promoting awareness, removing demand, supporting prosecution efforts, and providing appropriate service systems for survivors. I fully support their outstanding efforts and look forward to working with them on this important issue. And there's more we can do. Having served recently as Attorney General, I know that the states, and specifically the state attorneys general, feel hampered in their efforts to put an end to this insidious practice of using the Internet to sell illegal sexual services, especially when they are exploiting the victims of human trafficking. I would urge my colleagues to carefully consider any proposals that may come forward to close loopholes in the federal law that are furthering the victimization of young women being held in bondage. There are, unfortunately, no easy answers. Human trafficking can be hard to detect and even harder to prove. It is not unusual for victims to be unaware that they are victims of a crime. Their captors are often successful at persuading their victim that what's happening to them is their own fault. And because of the incessant and violent intimidation to which victims are subjected, they may be even afraid to attempt to escape the situation they find themselves in. Fearing retaliation from their captors, or perhaps fearing that they will be deported or returned to the situation they sought to escape from in the first place, they are reluctant to seek help, or even to offer help in punishing their captors once they are freed. The challenge faced in fighting human trafficking is compounded because not enough people, even in law enforcement and the justice system, recognize it when they confront it. That is why efforts to promote greater awareness of the signs of human trafficking are indispensable to the success of this fight. And everyone can take up this cause their own way. One of the more inspiring efforts has been initiated by a group of middle and high school students from my state. In 2010, under the guidance of Dan Papa, an extraordinary social studies teacher, students at the Jefferson Middle School in Jefferson Township, New Jersey, formed an organization called Project Stay Gold. The students participating in Project Stay Gold have created a website, pieces of art, and launched an innovative mobile project to raise and spread awareness of human trafficking. The students and their teacher have set some ambitious goals for their work. One of those goals is to enlist the help of the NFL to raise awareness of human trafficking in advance of Super Bowl 48. Madam President, as a New Jerseyan, that is a goal that I share. The people of New Jersey are excited to be hosting this year's coming Super Bowl at world-class MetLife Stadium. We look forward to playing the first outdoor cold-weather Super Bowl in history. But New Jersey is also determined to prevent the usual influx of victims of human trafficking who, it is widely acknowledged, have in the past been brought against their will to the host cities of large international events like the Super Bowl as part of an illegal sex trade. I will be working with everyone involved in presenting the Super Bowl, including the National Football League and the host committee, to raise awareness to eliminate this insidious practice. And I know that Mr. Papa and the students involved in Project Stay Gold at Jefferson Middle School will enthusiastically join me in that effort. Each of us, Madam President, has the opportunity to help give voice to the voiceless victims of human trafficking. That is why I intend to focus much of the time I do have in this body to advancing the goal of ending human trafficking and aiding the victims of this terrible crime. I look forward to working with all of my colleagues and with all those who share my commitment to this fight. Finally, Madam President, as someone who is new here and will not be staying long, permit me to express my appreciation to so many of my colleagues from both sides of the aisle who have been extraordinarily generous with their time, their knowledge, and wisdom in helping me meet the awesome responsibility that I've been entrusted with. Senator McConnell has been especially helpful to me. He is a leader not just by title, but by the way he conducts himself every day in this body. I also want to thank my fellow New Jersey Senator, Senator Menendez, whose collegiality and guidance have been of great assistance to me during my transition. Madam President, the Senate has long been guided by ancient traditions that have served the institution and the nation well. I trust that in the months and years ahead, it will continue to honor the practices that have caused it to be known as the world's greatest deliberative body. I will certainly try to do my part during my time here to honor those traditions and uphold the special and unique place this body holds in our system of governance. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The Republican whip.
Madam President, I just want to say briefly to our friend Senator Chiesa how much we appreciate his remarks here today, and I'm reminded, as the author of Ecclesiastes points out, time and chance happen to us all. And while he may not be with us a long time here in the Senate, I have every confidence, given his tremendous track record of public service and the confidence that Governor Christie's had in him to make this appointment, that we'll be hearing more great things about Senator Chiesa in the future.
The Republican whip.
Madam President, President Obama is scheduled to give a major speech on the economy tomorrow. Unfortunately, according to press reports, his new ideas for bolstering job creation bear a remarkable resemblance to his old ideas. Unfortunately, those ideas which have given us the weakest economic recovery and the longest period of high unemployment since the Great Depression. Now, the President will probably quite effectively talk about, quote, winning the future and helping America's youth compete in the global economy. But speeches are more than just words. They have to be about the policies. And unfortunately, on that count, notwithstanding the fact President Obama is a marvelous speech maker, his policies have resulted, as I said, in a weak economic recovery and a less prosperous America and more debt and burden for young people looking for a way out. So the problem is that President Obama's, not his speeches, but his actual policies have done tremendous damage to the economic prospects of the same people he purports to be championing. Indeed, the Obama economy has threatened to create a lost generation of younger Americans who are drowning in debt and are unable to find good full-time jobs. First, on the issue of debt. Since President Obama took office, the federal government has accumulated more than $6.1 trillion in new debt. Let me correct that. Since President Obama took office, the federal government has accumulated more than $6.1 trillion in new debt. Now, I doubt anyone within the sound of my voice can actually conceptualize how much money that really is. But under the President's latest budget proposal, that debt would grow even higher by another $8.2 trillion over the next decade. The gross debt is now larger than our entire economy, which is why every American child enters into the world owing $53,000 each. We might as well call them generation debt. Unemployment, as I mentioned earlier, remains intractable. The unemployment rate among young adults aged 18 to 29 is 12.7%. For the general population, it's 7.6%, but for those 18 to 29, it's 12.7%. That figure rises to 16.1% when we include 1.7 million young adults who've simply given up finding a job. And of course, these are real, live human beings, not just statistics. But the statistics are bad enough. And then there's the lack of good full-time jobs. Last year, the Associated Press reported that half of all recent college graduates are either jobless or unemployed in positions that don't fully use their skills and knowledge. A separate study in 2012 found that only 4 out of every 10 recent college graduates are doing a job that actually requires a 4-year degree. It's been estimated that 41% of all underemployed Americans are below the age of 31. And because, as we've learned, because of the Obamacare employer mandate, many full-time jobs are being reduced to part-time jobs, especially in the hotel, restaurant, and retail industries. In a new survey, 74% of small businesses said that they're going to reduce hiring, reduce worker hours, or replace full-time employees with part-time employees. In other words, it's not just the slowly growing economy, it is actually the policies of this administration which are making it significantly harder for younger Americans to find decent employment. And then, of course, there's the unkept promise of Obamacare. The President extravagantly promised, if you like what you have, you can keep it. For a family of 4, your premiums are going to be reduced by $2,500 on average. Well, we've found out that millions of Americans, if they like the coverage they have, they cannot keep it and will lose it, and that instead of a $2,500 reduction in premiums, of an average family of 4 will see an increase of $2,400. Once it's fully implemented, younger people will be especially burdened. They'll pay much higher health insurance premiums than they are today. Indeed, a recent survey of large health care insurers found that premium costs for young and healthy Americans in the individual and small group market will increase by an average of 169%. According to the Wall Street Journal, healthy consumers could see insurance rates double or even triple when they look for individual coverage under Obamacare. And it's not hard to understand why. Under Obamacare's provisions, you can wait until you actually get sick before you can buy insurance under a concept known as guaranteed issue, which then hardly resembles insurance as any of us think about it. And then because of the so-called age banding phenomenon, where premiums for younger people cannot be any more than, or for older people, cannot be any more than 3 times what they are for younger people, what's going to happen is younger people are going to have to pay higher premiums to subsidize the higher costs of caring for people when they get older. And then there is the triple whammy, perhaps, of higher education costs, some of which we're trying to address here with bipartisan student loan reform. But under President Obama, the average cost of tuition and fees at a 4-year public college or university has increased 27%. Again, Madam President, we've been talking about how do we deal with the interest rates on that debt, but the fact is the principal has gone up 27% just in the last 5 years. For that matter, it's estimated that 4 out of every 10 Americans who graduated from college in 2009, 2010, or 2011 have not been able to pay off any of their student debt. As a longtime Silicon Valley businessman recently noted, the millennials are the most educated generation in American history, but they're also the most indebted. Is there any wonder that only 1 out of every 5 recent college graduates say their generation will be more successful than the one that came before them? Now, my parents were part of the so-called greatest generation that Tom Brokaw coined that name, the World War II generation, people that risked everything they had and sacrificed all they had in order to ensure that my brother and my sister and I would have a better life and have more opportunities. But unfortunately, as a result of the failed policies that we've seen over the last 5 years, recent college graduates actually believe they're going to have less opportunity and less prosperity than generations that come before. There's no reason why that has to be the case. There's no good reason why the Obama economy has to become the new normal, Madam President, not in a country as hardworking, entrepreneurial, and innovative as the United States of America. Here in Washington, many policymakers seem to have forgotten the recipe, the secret sauce, if you will, for a strong, sustainable economic growth. Now, I would invite them to visit my state of Texas, which has been luring job creators from all across the nation. And lo and behold, you find that when people have opportunity and jobs, they tend to vote with their feet, which is one reason why after the last census, we had 4 new congressional seats created in Texas, because people had literally shifted from parts of the country where they couldn't find jobs to places like Texas where they could. Well, here's just some interesting comparison. In 2010, the Texas economy grew 71% faster than the national economy, 71%. In 2011, it grew 125% faster, and last year it grew 92% faster. These numbers reflect more than just happenstance. They reflect the difference between the policies that are embraced here in Washington, D.C., and the policies embraced in my state. For example, here in Washington, over the last 4 years, President Obama his policies had actually made it harder for businesses to create jobs because of taxes, because of regulation, because of things like the cost of Obamacare. In Texas, by comparison, we've worked very hard to make it easier. And indeed, if you want more of something, it seems to me you would make it easier to create, not harder, which is why Chief Executive Magazine has named Texas the best state for business 8 years in a row. Here in Washington, President Obama's policies have seen an increase in taxes by $1.7 trillion and increased our national debt by $6.1 trillion, as I mentioned earlier. In Texas, we have no state income tax, and we recently turned a $5 billion deficit into a projected $8.8 billion surplus, thanks to the leadership of our governor and the members of the state legislature. Here in Washington, President Obama has presided over the weakest economic recovery and the longest period of high unemployment since the Great Depression. In Texas, the total number of jobs has grown by nearly 32% since 1995, while the total number of jobs nationwide has grown by 12%, 32% versus 12%. And here in Washington, President Obama's policies have actually hampered one of our greatest natural resources, which happen to be our natural resources, energy production on federal lands, to be specific. In my state, public policies have consistently encouraged energy development, and total statewide oil production has increased by 94% between September 2008 and September 2012. And I say that, Madam President, at the same time where we are the #1 producer of electricity from wind energy. We believe and truly in all of the above approach. But Texans are unapologetic about our desire to create high-paying jobs in the oil and gas sector and produce the energy needed to power our state and the nation. All you have to do is look at the phenomenon occurring in the Eagle Ford Shale in central to South Texas and the Permian Basin in West Texas. Indeed, the Eagle Ford Shale produced 358 barrels of oil per day in 2008. Last year, it produced more than 352,000 barrels of oil a day. Over that same period, the number of Eagle Ford drilling permits increased from 26 to more than 4,100. Now, at a time when we see the Middle East continuing its trend of being a dangerous place, why in the world wouldn't we want to develop more of our natural resources here at home and create jobs at the same time, and to relieve our dependency on imported oil and gas from dangerous parts of the world? In the Midland area, which is part of the Permian Basin, high school graduates can earn $75,000 as a starting job driving a truck. Many students aspire to all sorts of other jobs, and they're trained for it. But the point is that energy production, taking advantage of the innovation and the technological changes in oil and gas production, can create jobs and opportunities and help wean us from imported energy. Here in Washington, unfortunately, the administration is still clinging to the misguided policies that are preventing the United States from reaching its potential its full domestic energy potential. Consider these numbers. Between 2007 and 2012, total U.S. natural gas production increased by 20%. Total U.S. oil production went up by 22%. However, oil production on federal lands, that is subject to the control of the federal government, actually went down 4%, while natural gas production on federal lands dropped by 33%. How do you reconcile the disparity? Well, the oil and gas and natural gas production occurred on private lands, owned by private parties, not the federal government. So the federal government's record is actually quite dismal in comparison. So the message to President Obama as he pivots once again, to the economy, the message couldn't be more obvious. If the President really does care about winning the future and helping the millennial generation compete in a globalized world, he should abandon the policies that have saddled younger Americans with so much debt and made it so difficult for them to find good jobs. In short, it's time to replace the Obama model with the Texas model. Madam President, this chart makes the comparison I mentioned earlier. Economic growth in 2010, after the 2008 fiscal meltdown, we saw the national economy growing only at 2.4%, the Texas economy at 4.4%. We need to get the national economy growing closer to 4% in order to create the jobs that are necessary to give young people an opportunity to work and provide for their families and to build for their future. In 2011, we saw actually the national economy slow down at 1.6% growth. And indeed, the Texas economy slowed down a little more, albeit at 3.6% growth. And then in 2012, just last year, while we still see the national economy is bouncing along at the bottom with only 2.5% economic growth in 2012, the Texas economy was growing at 4.8%. So I know my friends from other parts of the country might discount my remarks here today and say, well, this is just a senator from a state who's proud of the accomplishments of his state and the people who've made it possible. And they'd be right. I am. But this is also about what Louis Brandeis once called the laboratories of democracy. That's one reason why it's so important not just to have a national government, but a federal government with national responsibilities in those areas that the states and individuals can't otherwise take care of themselves. And reserving, as the 10th Amendment to the United States Constitution points out, all other power not delegated to the federal government being reserved to the states and to individuals. That's what protects our freedom, and that's what creates these laboratories of democracy. So Texas, so Illinois, so Washington State, any other state, Wisconsin, can try these policies and see what works and what doesn't. What creates the prosperity and opportunity for their people. And hopefully, just hopefully, we in Washington, D.C., those of us who happen to work here as part of our job, we will embrace those policies and those success stories and make them possible for the rest of the country as well. Madam President, I yield the floor.
President.
Assistant Majority Leader.
First, let me join the Texas Chamber of Commerce and everyone else and thank Senator Cornyn for this promotional speech on behalf of the state of Texas. He's very proud of his state, and I'm sure I would be too if I represented it. I represent a state called Illinois, and we're pretty happy with what we have in our state. Your governor comes in looking for jobs, and he looks longingly at Lake Michigan. They wish they had some water in Texas. We have a lot of it, and a lot of other things too. Each of us is proud of our states, and I'm not going to sit here and go through a tick list, even if I could, of what's wrong with Texas. I would like to speak to some of the national issues, though, that the senator from Texas raised. What about this Obamacare? If you listen to the description by the senator from Texas, it's a big hand of government coming down here raising the cost of health insurance for Americans. Well, why would they do that? Why would Congress pass something like that? Turns out that's not even part of the story. Here's the story. Too many Americans today don't have health insurance. They still get sick. And when they get sick, what do? They go to the hospital, usually the emergency room, and they get treated. And if they don't have the money through health insurance to pay for it, how does it get paid for? Raise your hand, America, if you own an insurance policy you're paying for the care of those without health insurance, transferring the cost of their care to the rest of America. Is that fair to your family or your business or to you? No. The idea behind Obamacare was to extend the reach of health insurance to more Americans. We've tried this, you know. Senator from Texas talks about the states as laboratories of experiment. We tried this experiment under someone called Governor Mitt Romney of Massachusetts. He came up with the original Obamacare, Romneycare, in Massachusetts and said everybody in the state's going to have health insurance, and it's working. We're trying to do this on a national basis so that everyone is engaged in paying for their health care and so that everyone has the peace of mind of being protected with a health insurance policy. Well, what about those policies? There's another thing not raised by the senator from Texas. What good is a health insurance policy if it isn't there when you need it? What good is a health insurance policy if it has a limit on how much it will pay and someone you love and your family just got diagnosed with a serious cancer illness and now faces surgeries, chemo, radiation that could run into the tens of thousands of dollars well beyond the coverage of your policy? That's when people face reality. And that's what Obamacare was all about. Take the lifetime limits off of health insurance so that if some unpredictable accident, disease, or illness comes your way, it won't bankrupt your family and you could still get good care. Those who want to abolish Obamacare ought to answer the basic question. Do you want to go back to lifetime limits when it comes to health insurance? And there's another element, too. You know, we've got some younger people in the United States Senate, but some of us have been around. Many of us are in a position where pre-existing conditions apply to all of us. If you had to fill out that questionnaire, there's probably something in your background, if you're in your 50s, 60s, or beyond, that would be characterized as a pre-existing condition. It might mean, in the old days, health insurance companies would say, no thanks. We don't want to run the risk of somebody who had high blood pressure, someone who has pre-diabetes conditions, someone with a person in their family with mental illness. And so they wouldn't sell you the health insurance. Pre-existing conditions. America, almost every family has one, whether it's a child or someone who's up in years. Obamacare says stop discriminating against Americans under health insurance policies for pre-existing conditions. When you hear the Republicans talk about eliminating Obamacare, do they want to go back to the day when you couldn't even buy a health insurance policy with a pre-existing condition? And what about this issue of insurance through your business that you work? Turns out 96% of the businesses in America today would not be mandated to provide health insurance coverage. They already do, or they wouldn't be required under the law. We're talking about a small percentage, but an important percentage. The President has said we'll give us an additional year to make sure we get this right and work with business for the right solution. I think that's reasonable. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. When it comes to writing laws, the only perfect law ever written was written on clay tablets and carried down a mountain by Senator Moses. Ever since then, we've done our best, and we can always do better. But here's the problem. The National Restaurant Association came to Chicago about 6 weeks ago, genuinely concerned about Obamacare and what it meant to their industry. And I listened to them, and I said, I'm willing to sit down with you. Let's find a way to help you and businesses just like you provide health insurance that's affordable for your employees. It's a right thing for them. And I said, I'll tell you what, I guarantee you, if you're willing to sit down and work out changes in Obamacare in a good faith way, I will bring Democratic senators to the table. All I ask you is bring Republican House members to the table. They can't do it. And you know why? You do, Madam President, because you served in the House of Representatives. Because on 67 separate occasions since we passed Obamacare, the Republicans in the House and Senate have called for votes to abolish Obamacare. 67 times. Somebody, Dana Milbank, I believe, in the Washington Post made that calculation just last week. 67 times. They have been unwilling to sit down and talk about any changes. No, we want to abolish it, and then we'll talk. It doesn't work that way. In the real world, we try to solve these problems as we go. I know that this Obamacare is important to this country. I think it may be the most important thing I ever voted on, because I've been there. I was a young father, a law student, married with a baby with a serious medical problem, and I had no health insurance. If you've ever felt helpless as an individual, as a father, as a husband, Get yourself in that position. There are millions of Americans who face that every single day. No health insurance and a heartbreaking illness in their family. Let's put an end to that. This country's far better than that. Let's aspire to something that really provides peace of mind to those across America. There are several other provisions in this bill I'll mention before I talk about higher education. Under Obamacare, we make certain that families with children under the age of 26 can keep their kids under their health insurance policy, the family health insurance policy. Why is that important? Because young people coming fresh out of college may not have a job, or they may have a job without health insurance. These young people can now stay under their parents' policies, over 100,000 of them in my state of Illinois. When I hear the Republicans call for abolishing Obamacare, I don't hear them calling for abolishing that. That's something that families need and want. Nor closing the donut hole. That's the amount of out-of-pocket expense that seniors have to pay for Medicare prescriptions. Obamacare closes that, so the out-of-pocket expenses diminish and eventually disappear. That's a good thing for many seniors faced with fixed incomes. I don't hear the Republicans calling for abolishing that either, and they shouldn't. The senator from Texas raised the question about the cost of higher education. He's right, and I believe he characterized it by saying under the Obama administration, the cost of higher education has gone up dramatically. Well, it's true that it did happen after the president was elected, but I didn't hear the suggestion from the senator of Texas that President Obama mandated it or caused it. What's happening across America is that states, because of their own budget problems, are cutting back on aid to higher education. Colleges, mainly public institutions, are raising the cost of tuition, and that raises the debts that students end up with when they go to school. It has nothing to do with President Obama. It's a fact, a serious fact, which brings us to the issue that will be on the floor this week, student loans. Currently, the student loan interest rate for subsidized loans, and that's for families $30,000 in income or less, is 6.8%. Just a few weeks ago, it was 3.4%. Now it's 6.8%. And so the question is, are we going to change it? Are we going to try to bring down that interest rate? Yes, we should. Students are deeply in debt, too deeply in debt, and if we can reduce the cost of what they borrow, we should. Now let me add a caveat here. Students need to think twice about borrowing. Of course they should go to college, but many of them are being lured into schools that are dramatically overpriced. Some of them are not worth it. That's a fact. The for-profit college industry is a good illustration. Ask a high school student if they know what a for-profit school is, and they'll say, I'm not sure, what is it? Well, it's the one that hits you right between the eyes on the internet every time you log on. These are the for-profit schools that are literally companies that make money off of offering education. The largest, University of Phoenix, the combined enrollment of the University of Phoenix is larger than the combined enrollment of the Big Ten schools. Number 2, Kaplan, which owns the Washington Post. And number 3, DeVry, out of Chicago. Those are the 3 big ones. What about those schools? There are 3 numbers to remember about for-profit schools, if you want to know. About 12% of all the kids coming out of high school go to for-profit schools. The for-profit schools receive 25% of all the federal aid to education, and the for-profit schools account for 47% of all the student loan defaults. Why? They charge too much. Their diplomas are worth too little. The good advice to young people is start with your community college if you don't have a clear path on your higher education. Affordable, many choices, and in most states those hours are transferable. But students are making high-cost choices and getting high-cost debt. So now we're discussing what to do about it. This morning, my friend, Senator from Vermont, the independent Democrat, Bernie Sanders, came to the floor and talked about the plight of young people, and he's right. They are too deeply in debt. There are too few jobs available. I worry about them, as everyone should. He concluded, though, at the end, that we shouldn't vote for the bipartisan student loan reform bill that we're working on here in the Senate, and I have to disagree with my colleague on that. Here's the reality. The interest rate today for undergraduate students is at least 6.8% on their student loans. Our bipartisan plan reduces that to 3.8%. A 3% savings for each student borrowing, undergrad student borrowing, for the loans that they need to go to school. 3% makes a difference. 6.8, 3.8 makes a big difference. Also, we make it clear that these students are going to be protected in the long run from high interest rates. We've put a cap on the interest rates that students will ever have to pay under our plan of 8.25% for undergraduate students. That, to me, is a sensible approach to take. We're trying to find a way to lower this even further. I believe in the premise that the federal government should be more actively involved to reduce the interest rate even more. But this is a good outcome. And for the next 4 or 5 years, students at all levels are going to see lower interest payments than if we do nothing. Some of my colleagues are upset. They don't like this outcome. They would like to see a much different relationship between the federal government and the students and their families. I would too. But I know where the votes are. With the Republican House of Representatives, with the need for 60 votes in this chamber, that type of reform is not likely to occur. So I urge my colleagues, when the time comes to vote on student loans and the student loan interest rate, don't leave us in a position where we keep the 6.8% interest rate. Let us bring it down to 3.8%, a more affordable rate. That is good for these students and their families. Then, let's join with Senator Harkin and Senator Alexander for higher education reform, to look at the overall cost of higher education, to work with the President and find ways to reduce the cost of education, and to make sure that we provide the education and training our students need to compete in the 21st century. Madam President, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Louisiana.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I now call up Vitter Amendment number 1744 to the appropriation bill currently before the Senate.
The clerk will report the amendment.
The senator from Louisiana, Mr. Vitter, proposes an amendment numbered 1744.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent to waive reading of the whole.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I hope this is viewed universally as a common sense bipartisan amendment, and I urge all of my colleagues to support this amendment through the roll call vote, which we will have. It's very simple, very basic, I think very appropriate. It says that for the most serious crimes that exist, violent crimes, crimes against women and children, very serious crimes by anyone's definition, that these will be disqualifiers for federal housing assistance. I bring this amendment, Madam President, for two simple reasons. First of all, I think this should go hand in hand with committing those extremely serious crimes. And again, we're not talking about threshold crimes. We're not talking about first-time drug offenses. We're talking about aggravated sexual abuse, murder, sexual exploitation of children, violence against women. Those are the four big categories. Very, very serious, very violent crimes, usually crimes focused on some of the most vulnerable in our society, like abused women and like children. So I think it's very reasonable and common sense to say these crimes have very serious consequences, and one of those, the most obvious, is a stiff jail sentence, in some cases life. But one of those consequences is also going to be the federal taxpayer is not going to give you housing or give you help for housing. But, Madam President, there's a second, I think equally maybe more important reason to support this common sense disqualifier, and it is to protect those other folks who need and use federal housing assistance and help clean up what historically has been areas that actually congregate violent crime and some of our worst social problems in federal housing projects. Madam President, I grew up in New Orleans. This has been a perennial problem in New Orleans, but I'm happy and proud to say it's a problem that's been getting better, being solved bit by bit, particularly post-Katrina. Like most major American cities, Madam President, in the 50s and 60s, huge housing projects began to be built and began to grow in New Orleans, and they were unfortunately centers of some of the worst of our social ills, particularly violent crime and drug abuse. And that's because we had policy which actually congregated, I hope that wasn't the intent, but actually tended to congregate the worst of those problems in these housing projects. And of course that fed on itself and made many of these problems even worse, and certainly subjected innocent folks trapped in those housing projects to some of the worst problems of our big cities. In New Orleans, since Katrina, we've taken significant steps to get away from that. And so we've instituted new policy. They're less dense, these housing projects. They're more mixed income. Not 100% of the folks in these projects are subsidized. It's usually a mixed approach so that you have some market-based, some partially subsidized, some heavily subsidized, less dense environments. And so we've taken specific steps trying to learn from the horrible mistakes we made in federal housing projects, particularly in the 1960s, early 1970s. This common sense test fits in exactly with that approach, and it says we're not going to subject people in these centers of subsidized housing to the worst violence and the worst social problems that we have. We're not going to congregate violent criminals, drug abusers, others in these housing projects. And so the second compelling reason to support this Vitter amendment is with innocent folks in those housing projects and who get some subsidized housing help in mind. They deserve better, and they do not deserve to be subjected to these worst of the worst, these horrible social problems that in the past we've actually congregated in public housing projects. So again, Mr. President, I hope this is viewed as it should be, as a common sense amendment, as one that deserves wide bipartisan support. And I would also note it is extremely similar to an amendment that passed on the recent Farm Bill without controversy, the same basic rule with regard to the food stamp program. And so I urge all of my colleagues, Democrats and Republicans, to support this straightforward, reasonable amendment on the roll call vote that we will have hopefully soon. Thank you, Mr. President. With that, I yield back the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Maine.
Thank you, Mr. President. First, let me commend the senator from Louisiana for his amendment. It would restrict criminals who have been convicted of certain violent or sex crimes from receiving housing assistance through HUD's public housing, choice neighborhood, and tenant and project-based Section 8 programs. Now, public housing authorities and private property owners who provide assistance under these programs are already required under federal law to deny admission or assistance to individuals who are subject to lifetime registration on a sex offender registry under a state program. However, when you move to the next stage, strangely enough, it's discretionary. Under current law, prior violent criminal activity may be grounds for the denial of assistance for public housing and the Section 8 programs, but it's not required to be grounds to deny that kind of assistance. And that is exactly the point that Senator Vitter is trying to make. So his amendment would tighten the current law to make it very clear that under certain categories, aggravated sexual abuse, murder and murder in the second degree, sexual exploitation and other abuse of children, and violence against women, that individuals convicted of those crimes would not qualify for public housing assistance under the programs that I've mentioned. As Senator Vitter said, this is a common sense amendment. It will help to make the housing safer for the law-abiding citizens who are residing in them. He has targeted serious crimes, and I think his amendment should be adopted. So, Mr. President, I am going to support the amendment, and I will be urging its adoption. Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I would suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Ms. Zaya.
Good afternoon. I'd like to call this hearing to order. Welcome to this hearing of the Judiciary Committee Subcommittee on Bankruptcy and the Courts. I'm pleased today to be joined by my ranking member, Senator Jeff Sessions. Senator Sessions has either been the chairman or ranking member of this subcommittee since 2001, with the brief exception of 2 years in the 111th Congress, during which time he served as ranking member of the full committee. His experience in overseeing the judiciary to ensure its efficient operation is unequaled, and I look forward to working with him as we continue that work together in this Congress. Broadly speaking, America's judiciary stands as a shining example of the genius of our founders. Vested with, quote, the judicial power of the United States, unquote, our federal courts act as a check upon executive or legislative overreach and as a neutral arbiter between parties in disputes. The limitations on government set by our Constitution, as well as the liberty interests reserved to the states and the people, ultimately rely on our judiciary to enforce them. When an individual is wronged or a business dispute arises, they can turn to our courts, get a fair hearing and a just resolution, and move forward with their lives. When the federal government seeks to deprive any...
that proceedings under the call be dispensed with.
The objection.
Mr. President, one of the issues and questions that have been raised by many of my colleagues about this bill is that at first glance it appears to be higher than the President's budget request for these two departments, Transportation and HUD, and the related agencies. And I want to explain why that is. It's a very legitimate question, but it has a very good answer. And the answer is that the President's budget for the agencies and departments under our jurisdiction is artificially low because it relies on gimmicks and it relies on scoring differences between CBO and OMB. So let me explain just a couple of areas where it will become evident to my colleagues why the difference exists and why the President's budget submission actually is not less than the bill that is on the floor now if true budgeting principles and accounting were used. First of all, the President's budget proposes to shift $2 billion in existing discretionary programs to mandatory in order to appear to achieve savings, including $1.5 billion from Amtrak's operating capital and debt service grants and $450 million by removing large hub airports from the Airport Improvements Program. In addition, the President's budget request assumes an increase in the passenger facility charge at airports from $4.50 to $8. Well, Mr. President, we've seen this movie before. When the FAA authorization was being considered just last year, Congress rejected this fee increase. There's no reason to believe that it's going to be accepted now, and yet that is built into the President's budget assumptions. We've seen him do that on a host of tax issues, too, so this is not unknown for this administration. There's another area which I think is highly significant. The President's request for Section 8 project-based rental assistance is insufficient to fully fund existing 12-month renewal contracts with the private property owners who participate in this program. In fact, Mr. President, it's about 10% short of the amount that the administration knows is going to be needed to renew these contracts for the full 12 months of the fiscal year. That's about $1.2 billion that it is short. And that is about half of the difference that we're talking about between the budget request and our bill. But surely it's not responsible to assume that somehow we're not going to pay these private property owners who are participating in the project-based Section 8 program for the full year of rental assistance. It's not going to stop after 10 months. They're not going to be evicting their tenants who are receiving the subsidy. So true and accurate budgeting would have required the president to put $1.2 billion into his budget request for this program. Finally, CBO scored FHA receipts, and by that I mean the fees, the mortgage insurance premiums, at $1.8 billion below OMB's score, which increased the cost of maintaining the existing level of services in our bill. Now, we know there are disputes between CBO and OMB all the time. In this case, I'm not suggesting that it's a gimmick, as in the other two examples that I've given you. I'm suggesting there's an honest difference of opinion. But the fact is, whether we like it or not at times, we're bound by CBO's score, and CBO's estimate of those FHA receipts, those fees, those mortgage insurance premiums, is $1.8 billion below OMB's score. That's quite a difference. So if you add up those gimmicks with the Amtrak program, moving from discretionary to mandatory, the assumption that Congress is all of a sudden, just months later, going to change its mind on the passenger fee, the passenger facility charge, and nearly double them after just rejecting that idea just months ago, the failure to fully fund the project-based Section 8 rental assistance, and the difference between CBO and OMB, the genuine dispute on FHA receipts. If you add that all up, it's just not accurate to say that our bill is $2.4 billion above the president's request. What we employed were CBO's estimate. We got rid of the gimmicks, and we used honest budgeting, and that accounts for the difference. So I hope my colleagues will not be misled into thinking that somehow this bill is above the president's budget request. When you apply honest accounting principles and take into account the $1.8 billion difference between the scoring of CBO and OMB, it's obviously not different. In fact, I would argue we are under the president's budget request. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President.